First of all, good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be presenting for you, especially on this particular topic, which, in my opinion, I don't think there's enough body of work regarding culturally responsive teaching within online learning. So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen and my presentation. So just give me a moment here. All right, and I decided to make my presentation through Prezi. And just in case, if some of you are unfamiliar with Prezi, it's sort of like PowerPoint, just a little bit different. It sort of has all your slides in sort of one image, and you're guiding through that one image instead of going slide by slide. It's a little bit more engaging than a PowerPoint traditionally can be, but I also don't think it's a make or break for a good presentation. So with that being said, let's get started. So as Derek had mentioned, I am an assistant director here at the University of Miami within the Distance Learning Institute. So you can imagine I deal with a majority of online learning classes, hybrid courses, and that's where my expertise is within this particular field. And the inspiration behind this particular session is this book by Zarita Hammond, and it's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And of course, she does get into a lot of neuroscientific terms and how the emerging field of neuroscience can definitely enhance the field of learning in general. But that really isn't what sort of at least what I gravitated towards in the book. She also shared a lot of experiences, and it starts off with some of her experiences as a teacher, but some of the more profound experiences are that which she shared in her childhood. Now, Zarita, she grew up in San Francisco in the Bay Area, and her grandparents were fortunate enough to come to San Francisco at a time where, particular neighborhoods, they weren't getting gentrified just yet. And that being said, when it came for Zarita to go to school, her mother decided to use her parents' address, so Zarita's grandparents' address, in order to attend a more prestigious public school. And so she was one of the only African-American students within her class. And she quickly realized when it came to, playing on the weekends or in the afternoon after class, that she was learning vastly different than her classmates within her own neighborhood. And I find this very interesting because, obviously when we think of segregation, we sort of tend to think of the South, the Southern states, but and really, segregation is still going on today in a lot of ways, right? With school zones, and this is a universal problem even in the 21st century, where where you live is dictating the quality of education that you're receiving. So that's sort of the backdrop, right? That's the foundation where she sort of inherently gained her experience and her path in life to really fall in love with education, because she saw that, man, a teacher can really make a difference. A belief system can really make a difference. And that being said, I kind of want to go into a little bit of the specifics of the demographics that we're dealing with, because typically when we're talking about culturally responsive teaching, it's really more K through 12, at least the research, right? It's talking about a K through 12 environment and particularly a face-to-face modality. But what do our online students look like? And these demographics, these statistics come from Education Today. And I'm not going to say that this is accurate for everyone's respective institutions. Obviously, it varies from school to school, region to region. But for the most part, I think a lot of these statistics hold true no matter the institution. So we are typically teaching, when we're teaching online, to a demographic that's a majority female demographic. And of course, like I mentioned, that can vary from school to school. For the most part, though, most online students are female. So that's an important characteristic to think about when we're designing online courses. And really the second point, which is pretty interesting to me, and I would probably put money on it that most of the online student demographics are much more diverse than your brick and mortar face-to-face 18 to 22-year-old demographics. And that's what this shows here. Where, a 29%, almost 30% of online student body is Hispanic, and African-American population is not far behind that. And So we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing to really, you know, do better by that demographic? Make sure that that demographic is learning in a way that connects with their culture and their background. But I think what's the most important here as far as diversity, right? Because I think oftentimes we think diversity is a skin color or culture, is socioeconomic diversity. A vast majority of our online students don't come from higher socioeconomic classes. And as the next statistic points out, 74.3% make less than $40,000 a year. And I want to add that, especially living in the city of Miami, I can attest that if you're making $40,000 a year or less in a city like Miami, if for a family of four, things can get very difficult. It would be difficult to make ends meet. So when I look at this particular statistic, I think about what's motivating these students, what's sort of behind the backdrop of what's that motivation? Why are they going back to school? And I would venture to say that a majority of that motivation comes from providing a better life for themselves and their families. And I think that's a testament to the access, right, that we're providing as faculty members that teach online and as instructional designers that are developing courses online. It really shows the game-changing demographics that we're dealing with here, and how fantastic it is that we're providing access to them. That being said, we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing to make sure that they are going to climb the economic ladder, that this degree, this piece of paper is going to mean something and they're going to gain some meaningful skills. And I think that's where we have to think critically as to what sorts of assignments, what sorts of feedback are we giving to our online students that is appropriate for the workplace. Because as the next statistic points out there, 81% are fully employed, full-time employees. And so this sort of speaks to the flexibility that online learning provides. And I'm not saying that we need to make things easier, right? I'm not thinking that we need to cater everything and kind of simplify anything within our subject matter. Rather, quite the opposite. We just have to be more purposeful with the sorts of assignments, with the sorts of content that we're creating and curating within our online courses. We have to be more purposeful with it and be respectful of the sacrifice that these students are making in their personal lives to receive this education from our respective institutions. And that being said, all the statistics show that online learning is the future of higher education, at least as far as growth is concerned. A vast majority of the enrollment growth that is happening within every institution is through online learners. And so I don't think we can think of ourselves, whether you're a faculty member, instructional designer, or a technologist, or a librarian who works with online students, we're not on the fringe anymore. It is very much the mainstream, and it is a mainstay of the academy. And we should think a little bit more critically about how we're curating and creating a real great learning environment in the online modality that's different than face-to-face. So a lot of what Zarita Hammond preaches for is this framework of rigor. And she talks about, in a sense, that, culturally responsive teaching is not about gimmicks. It's not about, having a culture day in class, in a potluck. It's not things of that nature. It's rather being rigorous and believing in your students and having projects that go beyond just the traditional midterm final format. And it's to really foster this environment that an individual learner can thrive. And what I find interesting is that Zarita Hammond's talking to a K through 12 group, right? She's talking to teachers. She's talking to instructors who teach face-to-face when she's making these suggestions. But interestingly enough, I think it fits perfectly with online learning, because oftentimes I think a good online learner has to be willing to accept individual learning, right? They're learning as individuals. They're kind of going through the content, going through assignments, and so they should gain some skills on how to learn on their own. And that being said, some of the steps that we can take, right, as instructors, instructional designers, is maybe instead of being that sage on the stage, right, what works with face-to-face classes, with lecture and storytelling, do not lean so heavily on that modality or that format when it comes to online learning. Embrace being that guide on the side, and being flexible to learning, and being flexible to the interest of your students can really go a long way to adhering to this culturally responsive pedagogy. And I do want to point out that, interestingly enough, what's important for diverse cultures is also important for everybody, right? I think that when we're talking about best practices of culturally responsive pedagogy, it helps every student, right? If we have more thoughtful projects, if we scaffold our projects and make various deliverables, I think it could be very powerful for the students. And in the same token, as much as I would personally promote scaffolding complex projects or complex subjects, I do think it's important to allow your students to fail, right? And maybe not scaffold everything, maybe don't break everything down, and give students an opportunity to fail. I'm a big believer, and I don't know if this is an official term, but I'm a big believer in this idea of pedagogy of failure, because I think nothing great has been achieved without failure, right? I mean, every person who has invented anything, any person who has contributed to any sort of body of knowledge has had speed bumps along the way. And, in a classroom, particularly an online class, it's such a controlled environment that we're really missing out on an opportunity to sort of have teachable moments, and have moments where students can safely, right, for the most part, fail and learn something from that failure, and see how they can improve in the future. And I think that goes to, just embracing a little bit more of a different perspective when it comes to online students. If they're adult learners, if they're working full time, I don't think that we can spend too much time on the nurturing stage, and we have to really get into the project, the nitty gritty of each particular subject, so that they can gain the skills that can hopefully increase their work life. So she also mentions that retrieving long-term information, and I think this is her approach, and I'm a constructivist at heart as well, of really, I don't think that us in education, what our job is just to create people who can regurgitate information, right? That's what we have Google for. That's why I can look at my phone right now and find countless points of information that I didn't know before. So we're not creating students. We shouldn't be creating students who can answer A, B, or C. We really should be creating students that create new bodies of knowledge, that think of things differently. I think often in education, it's either black or white, right? There's a wrong answer and a right answer. And I don't think we embrace the ambiguity of knowledge and information and how it could change, right? We used to think Pluto was a planet, and now it's not a planet anymore. So knowledge itself is always changing. And I think we have to be comfortable with allowing our students to bring in their experiences and their sort of knowledge into the course, and to share it with students in a safe environment where everyone will be respected for their opinions. And I do want to point out that, that quote there at the end of my slide here is culturally responsive teaching isn't a set of engagement strategies you use on students. Instead, think of it as a mindset, a way of looking at the world. And I think that's really important, because when I've seen news articles, when I've read news articles, or when I've seen videos of culturally responsive teaching, man, it's a teacher doing handshakes with every one of their students before class. It's a teacher who raps before a math class. And although that's entertaining, and it could very well engage students, get them excited about a topic, it really does nothing to help them learn. Absolutely nothing. They're gimmicks. And that's not what culturally responsive teaching is. And that's not what Zarita Hammond is advocating for. Quite the contrary, it's being thoughtful in the way we're evaluating students and what we think they're capable of, and making sure that we always have the highest standards for our students, regardless of their demographics and regardless of where they come from. So just food for thought there. Now, I think at the crux of being culturally responsive within our online courses is creating truly engaging assignments. And the way that Zarita Hammond phrased diversity wasn't that she talked about each race or each culture individually. She split it simply into two groups, in the sense of we have individualistic cultures, and then we have collectivist cultures that tend to think whether either it's the individual that is the most important or the collectivist, the collective group that's most important. And that's really, when we're talking about diversity of mindsets, that's really what we're catering to. So instead of being bogged down by trying to cater to a specific country or region or person, it's not about that, but it's really understanding that we have individualistic cultures and collectivist cultures, and what are we doing to sort of bridge that gap? And interestingly enough, here in the US, within her book, we're rated as the highest country for, or at least the highest rate for individualistic sentiment. So we in the US are very much individualistic culture, and we hear it every day in our vernacular. He's a self-made millionaire. He pulled himself from his own bootstraps, and we have a lot of this mentality, and even the American dream, right? American dream seems like an individual goal that we all should sort of strive for. And the truth is that that's not the case, right? No one has been able to achieve anything on their own, truly. And so, like the AirPods that I'm currently wearing right now, it's an Apple product. I highly doubt that it was just one person, one man or one woman working on this project that created these headphones and then mass produced them. There's really a community, a mass of people that have helped make certain innovations happen. And now these next couple of slides are actually from a previous presentation that I made with a colleague regarding collaboration. And the truth is that collaboration is at the heart of being culturally responsive, right? Because if we're dealing with an individualistic culture or a collectivist culture, we need to sort of bridge those gaps. And we need to provide opportunities for those who may be more collectivist in nature to succeed. And now the image here is of a woolly mammoth and a bunch of men surrounding this animal, this giant beast, trying to kill it. And a successful hunt would mean that they have clothes for the rest of the year. They might have food for months, seeing how big the animal is. The tusk could be used for weapons, for self-defense. So tackling this big animal is really, it means a lot, right? It leads to a lot of positive outcomes for this tribe or this group. And what's interesting is that it could not have been achieved by anyone's self, right? None of these individual hunters could tackle this woolly mammoth on their own. It takes a collective group to accomplish this goal. And I sort of want to create that image to sort of equate receiving a degree, right? That's the goal. That's the big beast in a lot of people's lives is receiving that higher education. And we as instructional designers and faculty members need to do our part to sort of create that community, that learning community that helps them achieve that ultimate goal. And so what are some ideas as far as incorporating some collaborative assignments in your courses? And it starts off with discussion boards. And I'm very aware that for a vast majority of online courses, discussion boards are, not very robust, not usually accomplishing what they set out to accomplish. But there's two things that I want instructional designers and faculty members to think about when they're creating discussion boards, which is first, what sort of questions are you asking? If you're asking a question that only has one right answer, I would argue that that's probably not the best approach to a discussion board, and that discussion boards should have questions that pose ambiguous questions and that have ambiguous answers, that there's really no right or wrong, and that someone really can take a stance and argue for it in a completely correct way. And then secondly, they need to be worthwhile. I often see discussion boards in online courses and they're only worth 10% or 5%. And then oftentimes students are discouraged. They're wondering, well, man, I guess I don't have to write all that much, or maybe I can copy from another student, their post, and sort of rephrase or reword their approach. And I think if you make it worth something, if you make it a significant portion of the class, if you make it matter, it will matter for the students themselves. So just keeping that in mind is that, you know, having a high weight for discussion boards can really make a difference in the quality of work that's being done by students. And the second is, of course, everyone's favorite, collaborative assignments, collaborative projects, if you will. And I can't tell you how often I hear, right, from people how difficult it is to work in teams, especially in classes. Oh, you know, I'm always the person that works for the whole project, and there's always one person who doesn't do their part. And I hear that often, and I find it interesting because it's usually that same flaw with group work that people point out, but they're always the one that does the most work. And I always find that interesting. Every single person that has a complaint about group work is the person that does all the work. So I'd like to know, I like to meet a person who is the person who typically does not do the work. So what are some ways for us to circumvent sort of those flaws with online learning? I think a lot of it is having multiple deliverables, right? Not waiting to the end of the semester to turn in assignment or turn in a project from a group. I think if we have deliverables early on in the semester, the professor has an opportunity to then intervene within the group and figure out how they can fix the situation and remedy the situation. And sort of, it doesn't become a problem at the end, where then it might be more difficult to make adjustments or make changes to groups. So I think having multiple deliverables is really important. And that's what this particular slide is showcasing, is in this course, this professor had multiple deliverable points, and it sort of scaffolded up to complexity for the group. And he still has this group assignment, and he very rarely has any complaints from students. And I think a lot of it is because he has a deadline early on, forces the students to get together. It forces them to not push it back, to not ignore it, and sort of engage with the material from the get-go. And so that's my suggestion, to sort of circumvent a lot of the flaws with online learning, or at least collaborative group work. And I will argue that even when it's difficult to work in groups, that in and of itself is a teachable moment, is something that we can utilize, and that happens, right, in the workplace. Sometimes it's difficult to communicate with individuals. Sometimes it's hard to get a hold of them and get them to do their part. And these are all teachable moments, real skills that students can gain that translates into the workforce. And sort of the third option here, and this is for classes that might be just too large. You know, I've seen courses where they have 100+ online students, and I understand it. I can empathize with a professor. They're not going to split all the students into groups and then grade all these assignments. They're going to stick to that midterm final format, and that's all. But I think there's a different approach that we can take to the typical midterm final format, which is create a more collaborative assessment. In my belief, and I think the research proves this, it takes a much higher order thinking to create a question than it is to answer a question. So I venture to say that maybe we should have midterms and finals that are created by a class, that the class helps develop, and each group or each person sort of makes their addition to the test. And I think this can be very powerful and used in a lot of different ways. It helps the students study and think differently and a little bit more thoroughly about the subject. But then it gives an opportunity for students to still communicate with each other within a large class. So collaborative assessments is definitely something to consider, especially if you have one of those larger online courses and you still want to add collaboration to it. And what's the goal here, right? What are we trying to advocate for with culturally responsive pedagogy? And it all comes down to creating a learning community. And as you can see here with this chart is that there's a lot of factors that go into creating that educational experience that embodies a learning community. And I think we have to be safe, like I mentioned before, with working within the gray area of knowledge and information, and being willing to question and think critically. You know, this is higher education, right? We should be asking higher order thinking questions and trying to find deeper knowledge and deeper answers. And one thing that I do get a little bit frustrated with is when we're talking about online learning, it seems like all the work, everything the student does has to be done behind a computer. And I don't think we take advantage of the lack of restrictions that are given to us through online learning. We'll have students from multiple states, multiple cities in our area, even international. We should take advantage of that body of knowledge and the information and the breadth of experiences that they bring to the table to create this learning community. And I think it starts off with asking your students to, go to the outside world. I can imagine that whether your art history class, asking students to go to an art museum, their local art museum, and sort of share their experiences with their fellow students. Like, those sorts of topics need to be utilized a little bit more within online learning. Let face-to-face modality be the one that's controlled within a space and time. But online learning is not controlled by space and time. And we should utilize that factor a lot more. And that learning doesn't always happen, just like it doesn't always happen in a classroom from 9 to 9:50. It doesn't always happen within a set period of time and place behind a computer. And I think us as instructors and instructional designers, we need to embrace that fact and try to incorporate more external features of online learning and allow students to explore their communities and how this particular subject, regardless of what it is, how it connects to the world they live in. So, just trying to develop, right, that learning community, which I think can be absolutely created within an online modality. And obviously it takes teaching presence, it takes a social presence, but it takes a lot of openness and being okay with, I like to say, being comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I think that's when we're learning some stuff, is when we're actually questioning some deeply held beliefs and we're thinking differently. That's when learning really is happening, right? Those are the types of sort of situations we want to put ourselves in as educators. Because at the end of the day, education, it can be argued that it's to create a workforce, but at the heart, right, at least and the ideal of education is to create a citizenry that can be engaged with its society. And we should never lose sight of that regardless of the subject that you're teaching, instructing, that we're trying to create a more informed citizenry. And that benefits everybody. It benefits the community. It benefits your university for having engaging alumni. It just works all around. So I think online learning can be critical to this point. And I think a main factor in creating this learning community is by providing quality feedback. And when we're talking about culturally responsive teaching, I think oftentimes where the failure tends to happen is in this particular area, which is feedback. And I'm guilty of it. And I think it's just how we learn, right? Everything's different. I know blue is blue because it's different than yellow, it's different than red. You look at someone, you know that they might be culturally different than you just because of their skin color. We immediately gravitate towards the differences of individuals and what's different than me. And we do the same when we're grading academic work. We immediately gravitate towards what's wrong with a paper or what's wrong with a project. And we seamlessly ignore, oftentimes, right? We ignore what was good about the assignment, what was good about the project. And we can't ignore it. Feedback has to be both positive and reflective and constructive. And I would venture to say it should never be negative, because you as the instructor, we should always believe that the students are capable of what we think they're capable of, right? We got to hold them to that high standard. And it goes back to Zarita Hammond's format of rigor, right? Culturally responsive teaching isn't simplifying anything. It's not making anything easier. It's quite the contrary, making things more complex and less, less concise and more ambiguous. That's really what culturally responsive teaching is. And when we're giving feedback, we should still hold our students to a higher standard, but also meet them where they are. And I think in academia, we get really strung up about our typical day-to-day vernacular, which is great. Us in the academy, we speak in a great way, with a lot of intelligent words. And then maybe when we're grading undergraduate papers, we're a little bit distraught that they're not at our same level. And I think oftentimes we have to confront that bias and say that, it's the crux that's the most important. Are they getting their message across? Do you sense that they're understanding the subject? That's really what's most important, and believing in them. And I've unfortunately I've talked to professors where they complain about their students' intelligence, and I think when we go into any sort of class, whether it's face to face or online, and we already have this perspective like, oh, millennials or people in Gen Z, they're not as smart, or they're always on their phones. When we go into any classroom environment with those biases already ingrained, we're doing injustice to our students. We can't go into any sort of classroom, whether online or face to face, with a lot of carrying those biases. We have to go in with fresh mindset and a fresh outlook, and realizing that we're going to hold these students to this high standard, and we're going to help them get there. We're going to guide them to that end, right? Together, we're going to hunt down that woolly mammoth. And so moving forward, right, we've talked a lot about culturally responsive teaching, but there's an interesting, I guess, second part to this, which is how do we sustain, right? How do we sustain this pedagogy within our society, within our respective schools? Because we might implement it within our own course, but how do we sustain it within our daily lives? And I think it speaks back to a little bit of what I mentioned of meeting your students where they are and embracing the vernacular that you get with your students. And obviously you want them to be grammatically correct. I'm not advocating for, periods everywhere or misplaced commas wherever you can find. I'm not advocating to accept that type of work. What I'm advocating for is understanding their vernacular just as much as they have to understand your vernacular. So if a student has an accent, obviously do not point that out, or do not simply always try to correct their pronunciation of particular words. It might seem like you're doing a good thing for them, but truthfully, I think you're doing more harm than good. And also embracing multiple languages. I not to be too controversial here, but I think back to the founding fathers of this country, and they were very much intellectuals, right? They were people who spoke multiple languages, and this sort of mentality of English only, that has taken our country by storm, especially as of recent events. It's not the way to true intellectualism. And our world is becoming extremely globalized. And it's to everyone's benefit to at least be comfortable embracing other cultures. Because chances are when we're traveling or even going to a new city, we'll be confronted with a unique and different culture than our own. And we should try to embrace it as much as possible and do the same for our students. I think back on my own experience. I was born in Puerto Rico, raised in Orlando, Florida, and I immediately realized that my Spanish was not something I should speak. Right, I was and they didn't even have ESOL classes when I was in school. I was mixed up with the special ed kids because I couldn't speak English. So there goes to show you, how things were mishandled back then. But I immediately was struck by maybe my language is wrong and English is right. And we do not want to create that environment for learners. And obviously that becomes an issue for early learners, kids in the K-12 environment, but it could still hold true for the students in higher education. We should make them feel comfortable with their culture, with their native language, and realize that adds into the body of knowledge, right? That adds into sort of break the chains of this black and white mentality to education. So just something to think about. And I will read this quote to you if you guys don't mind. Culturally sustaining pedagogy seeks to perpetuate and foster to sustain linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as part of the democratic project of schooling. We are more than educators. We are, creating, we're progressing our democracy is what we're achieving by truly giving a quality education to individuals and giving that access. We're democratizing our society by allowing students who work full time, who might not make enough, who might be historically discriminated against, to achieve, gain that piece of paper that sort of allows them to enter a new field, a new workforce, and really embrace different forms of our society. And what we're doing is something truly special as educators. And I definitely want to promote that. As much as I'm critiquing the typical status of online courses, I also want to congratulate everyone and the work they do every single day to provide education and to make our democracy, right, better, to have our conversations be better, our debates be better. So you guys are doing great work. And with that, I want to share a little bit of my contact information. I am about to open it up here for questions, or if people want to talk about their experiences regarding this topic, I'd love to hear it. But maybe if you're too shy to sort of share it within this format, I'd be happy to answer any of your questions through email or through phone. So definitely feel free to get in contact with me that way. So with that being said, I'm gonna stop sharing here. And I'm gonna start seeing if Derek can help me out here and sort of organize the questions here.
Okay, Luis, very, very well done. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
So I'm going to ask that people would indicate somehow if they want to ask a question, and I will try to unmute you and allow you to ask that question, or if you just want to type your question in chat, please. Okay, and that's Thomas. I'm going to try to open up Thomas. I may just have to open up everybody.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, see Thomas. Uh-oh. Quite a few people in the, okay, unmuted see Thomas here. Thomas, go ahead, or see Thomas, go ahead. Your question, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to thank Louis for his presentation.
Oh, very good, thank you.
Oh my goodness, thank you. I appreciate it.
And the chat window has been very active and engaging throughout your whole presentation. A lot of people shared their personal experiences and stories related to your presentation, so that was very encouraging. If anybody else would like to make a comment or ask a question, please indicate in the chat and I'll try to open you up. Let's see. Well presented.
And if anybody wants to share experiences as well, I'd love to hear your experience as a faculty member or instructional designer trying to, cater to this demographic. I saw in the chat room that there are some examples, so I don't know if anybody would want to share some of those examples.
And just so everybody knows, I am going and unmuting everybody one by one here, so just so you know. Okay, and then it looks like everybody has the ability to still mute themselves. So
awesome. Yeah, and I see two questions here from. I'm going to start off with Tom R. Do you have any resources for creating engaging discussion forums? And I think as far as like a website or information, I don't particularly have anything that I can think of at this moment, and it always varies from topic to topic. But I think just sort of keeping with that ideal of making sure that your questions are ambiguous enough, and then, like I mentioned before, making sure that they're worth a significant portion of the grade can go a long way to creating quality discussion boards. I don't want to stick to any particular type of question or style. I think that should always be open creatively. But that would be my suggestion for that. And let me see here. I see, do you think this is from Fiona Crystal, do you think there are any particular strategies that should be employed for certain underrepresented groups? So what I loved about Zarita Hammond's book is that she did not get down to the nitty gritty of particular groups and cultures. She really broke it down to, we have an individualistic society, but we have a lot of groups that are represented by collectivist societies. And so it's just embracing maybe more collectivist approaches. So this could be something like allowing the syllabus to be co-created with the other students within your course. Something as simple as that can go a long way to sort of have students buy in and know that they're part of the process, right? Instead of being taught to, we're all building this learning community together. And I think that approach serves best all groups. And that's why I want to advocate for what's great for underrepresented groups is great for everybody. It's not a A or B sort of situation. So just keep that in mind that, it's trying to let every one of your students participate in the learning experience of the course is how best to deal with that. And let's see here. I missed the author. Do you mind repeating it? Zarita Hammond. There it is. Perfect. Someone wrote it. Thank you.
Luis, I have a question.
Yes.
And hi, thank you for
Hello.
your session.
Absolutely.
So something that kind of strikes me is that we have a lot of people here at Appalachian specifically that we're speaking the same kind of song in regards to culture responsive teaching and learning and all that stuff. As we get into other sides of the state, we tend to go to places that are pretty rural and that people are not so familiar with other people from other places, specifically being a foreigner myself. So do you have any recommendations or any experiences? I know Miami is very different because you have a big population of people that are different and speak different languages. But in this area, that is not the norm. We tend to be the newcomers. And people have this reaction of, like you mentioned, something strange, something is different, is a threat. How do we change that mindset, specifically in places that are not familiar? And I know I do my big part in trying to make a difference, but do you have anything from your research or from your experiences that can be helpful?
Yeah, great question, Juanes, because at the end of the day, I think when we think of diversity, right, I think it's automatically assumed of a cultural diversity. And I think allowing others, let's say in the rural parts of North Carolina, to realize that maybe they're not Hispanics or Black, but they are equally part of that diversity, right? They are equal members of culturally responsive teaching, especially, considering that, if they're in rural areas of the country, chances are that their economic situation, right, is not one that is solid, one that makes them be comfortable. So I really think that it's having tough conversations. It's embracing those misunderstandings and trying to be that guide on the side through, trekking through that. So if I'm an instructor and let's say I have an international student in a course where a vast majority of the other online students come from rural North Carolina, and they're having a difficult time with the accent, right? They're like, I've been meeting with this person, I can't understand any word they're saying. It's really embracing that teachable moment and not being scared to talk to that student, to host a sort of a mediation with that student and maybe the international student to sort of find some common ground. Because unfortunately, we always focus too heavily on the differences and not on the similarities, on how much we are alike. And ultimately, right, regardless of what their background is, Juanes, they're all wanting the same thing, right? They all want a degree from Appalachian State University, and they all want to get there and really kind of embrace that collectivist approach that together we'll get there, not as individuals, but together. And I think that can be very powerful and it's something that people keep for a very long time, because those are the experiences that we remember the most, the experiences where we connect with each other and we have good moments and bad moments. That's the stuff we remember. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Juanes. Anybody else would like to ask a question? I think it appears that you may have to unmute your own audio and you may have to start your own video down in the lower left. I believe Juana has figured out how to do that, and I think Juana, did you do that yourself? Did you unmute your audio and turn your own video on?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
So I think the rest of the participants may need to do the same. I've been unsuccessful unmuting people. All right. And just so everyone knows, this the presentation was recorded, and we'll have it on the Free Learning Conference website following. I'm muted on my phone deliberately to prevent feedback. Okay, so a few people have muted themselves purposefully, and that's fine.
Awesome. I don't know if anybody it doesn't have any questions. I really appreciate everyone attending this my session here. I'm very thankful that you took the time out of your busy day and your Friday to listen to me talk about culturally responsive teaching. So I'm very thankful.
Yeah, and you had about 30 participants in this session, so
awesome.
Good participation, I would think.
30 is a solid number.
Yeah, well done too.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I love to read the comments. Thank you. So together we will create a better learning environment online. So that's what I love most about it. Adios, que tienen un buen fin de semana, right? Have a great weekend, everybody.